Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel that only posts school projects, and true to that fashion, today we're going to be discussing anxiety and how our culture has shaped what we know as anxiety. I don't claim to be an expert, I don't claim to know everything about this subject. I do claim to have a lot of wild theories, and those will be discussed today, but I think that they're insightful to any that hear them, and I hope that this message resonates with you. And Professor, I really hope I get an A on this project. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to be discussing generalized anxiety disorder, which is actually the most common disorder in the US, and it impairs a lot of people, and I believe it's very important to discuss this and hopefully reach other people with my crazy theories or whatever knowledge I do know about this subject, because it gives them the ability to better understand themselves. Especially because there are so many people that go through this, like Oprah Winfrey, Jennifer Lawrence, Kristen Stewart, all of these celebrities go through anxiety, and it's a condition which truly affects the day-to-day life like no other. Let's just dive on in. Generalized anxiety disorder is a disorder marked by persistent and excessive feelings of anxiety and worry about numerous events and activities. Now, according to the DSM, which is the Diagnostics Manual for Psychology, you have to qualify, you have to have like certain criteria in order to qualify for the diagnosis, and several of those are for 6 months or more, a person experiences disproportionate, uncontrollable, and ongoing anxiety and worry about multiple matters. So the symptoms must include at least 3 of the following: edginess, fatigue, poor concentration, irritability, muscle tension, sleep problems, and significant distress or impairment. Significant distress or impairment is a byproduct of all of these symptoms. So if it's not causing someone distress or impairment, then they don't necessarily qualify for it. I don't know. It's complicated. I am not a psychologist yet. Now I want to discuss the models and the psychological perspectives on anxiety. When it comes to anxiety disorders, and mostly any disorders, there are 3 different models. There's the biological model, the cognitive behavioral and psychodynamic model, and the sociocultural model. With the biological model, there's genetic variations to hyperactive fear, circuits, behavioral inhibitions. This is the whole discussion of nature versus nurture. So you're looking at basically your genes. You can be predisposed to anxiety in this or something, or it's just like in your genetic makeup. I'm eating my hair, excuse me. Versus nature, which is basically the role of like the parent, which is the cognitive behavioral and psychodynamic model. The role of parenting styles, like overprotective. If you have like a very rigid upbringing, you could be more prone to anxiety. I want to focus most on the sociocultural model, which is the influence of life stress, poverty, school difficulties, family disharmony, peer pressure, and community danger, and how that affects and shapes anxiety. A lot of times we have the nature versus nurture debate, but it doesn't always take into account your surrounding. That's what I really want to focus on, especially how the human condition and how we were meant to live affects our mental state and cognition currently. For that, I'm going to have my best friend and history expert, not like officially history expert, but he's knowledgeable. We're gonna have him come in and join me in this little discussion, and we are going to talk about how human society has evolved to cause anxiety and other disorders. So let's get into that. Now joining me, historical savant Davis Petro. Hello, Davis.
Hello, Melina.
Pleasure to have you on
Pleasure's all
this video.
mine.
You describe the conditions early humans lived in during the primal psychological development of our species.
So for most of human history, human beings lived in what were called kinship groups or kinship bands, and that was usually between 200 and 300 people. Now there were matriarchal societies and patriarchal societies, but that's kind of splitting hairs. But if you're looking between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and even North America and South America, Paleolithic and Neolithic groups of people were about 200 to 300 people, and they all split work, and they definitely interacted with one another, different groups and tribes, but it was very small and isolated, and everyone knew each other, and everyone had a place that they belonged.
Can you describe the places that they belonged to, how the work was split up between them?
So in a patriarchal society, generally it would be the men who hunted, gathered food, did a lot of the heavy labor, things like that, took on leadership roles, fought with other tribes. And in a matriarchal society, a lot of that's still kind of similar, where men fought other tribes, but leadership roles would have been with women. It would have been women, with multiple husbands as opposed to men with multiple wives.
And how did they respond psychologically to their environment around them?
A lot of the times it would have been a fight or flight response. You're living in nature with all these big animals. You're hunting down in the Ice Age, woolly mammoths, things like that. You got to be able to make decisions split second that are life or death in many cases.
We had this primal way of thinking and way of life, and now we're living in a society and a culture where you don't have to spend so much of your energy and your time just to stay alive. So how do you think fight or flight has affected us currently?
I think it's definitely changed quite a bit because, like I said, this was most of human history, so we're talking hundreds of thousands of years, whereas in the past 2,000 years, we went from living that traditional way that we had for all of human history to living the way we do now. So we have cities with millions and millions and millions of people, and we have social media and the internet. You're connected to other people all the time. You know infinitely more people than you would have, back in prehistoric days. And again, we've neutralized pretty much every single primal threat that humanity faced. So fight or flight does not necessarily play as much of a role in modern society as it did back then, and because of that, we're seeing a lot of people get very anxious at very minor things. Not to downplay anybody's issues, but it's the anxiety that you have today is not necessarily what your brain evolved to deal with.
You're discussing that now we're constantly connected with all of these people, but it seems to be that we live in some of the loneliest times because the connection that we have reflects as superficial on the surface. And so as opposed to when you lived in a primal way of life and you had a setting of 200 or 300 people that you had community with, now we don't necessarily have that, and it's led to an uprising in all of these different mental disorders. How do you think about that?
Well, I think you're exactly right, because it is very surface level, a lot of the relationships that we have. People can live in an apartment complex, such as we're in right now, or a neighborhood, and not even know your neighbors. Whereas back in the day, long time ago, you had these groups of 200 to 300 people who you rely on for everything. These people are related to you in some way, possibly. You all work together, you all live together, you're all surviving together. Whereas now that's not necessary. You can rely on comparatively few people in your day-to-day life and survive just fine. You can go weeks at a time without ever having any kind of meaningful social interaction.
And that's really fascinating because if you look at the trends of, let's take into account suicide, for example, you have drop in suicide rates around times when we're in strife, such as like when World War II happened or the bombing in London. You have lower suicide rates because you have to come together with people, and you're seeing people normally more so and in a different setting than you would currently now in day-to-day life.
And in those stressful times, it builds a community. It builds a common enemy, a common goal that everybody works around, and so there's unity amongst everyone in a city or a country, which you did not have before in an industrial or post-industrial society.
So one could deduce from this that because our culture has become so individualized in at least America and Western countries, then you have more rates of anxiety and depression, but specifically anxiety because now you have these like survivalist emotions and hormones like fight or flight that you had at one point that served a purpose, and now they're just kind of here, and it's like, where do you go from here now?
Exactly, and before these fight or flight responses were very, very useful dealing with survival issues and things like that, whereas instead we are less focused on, as a society, as a species now, on survival than we were back then, and more focused on issues like money, like, when's rent due, what's all this going to be, what are my grades in school, for instance. So the fight or flight kicks in places where it doesn't really matter, or it doesn't have the same utility as it did.
Which also can be evident when it goes to deciding what field or what career you want to go into, or like even just your major, Or even, what am I going to have for dinner? Because now you have all of these options, so many choices that humans aren't used to seeing. Because back in the primal days, where what we were made and equipped for is you had your options were, okay, berries and meat for dinner today, and also berries and meat for dinner tomorrow. So you had less options in front of you, but more danger. And so now you have more options in front of you and less danger, and so all of that fight or flight has got to go to something else, and that's where you get all the indecisiveness. So overwhelming because there are just too many options nowadays.
We have all these institutions and organizations that exist in this framework around us as a species that we've never had before. There's so many things that exist today that didn't exist 20, 30, 40, 100, 200 years ago that we all have to deal with as a fact of living in modern civilization that have never existed before or even been conceived of before. So there's a disconnect between what we think is good and what works for people versus our evolutionary psychology and how we can actually adapt to situations.
Perfectly said.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Millie.
Okay, well, that's all I have time for today. I hope that this has been somewhat enlightening. I hope that anyone who has watched this has learned something from it. I wish that I had time to share more, but I feel like this is very important to understand that our brains and bodies were meant to perform and act a certain way, and because of what society demands from us, it's very difficult to stay within their guidelines and follow the rules that they've laid out for us. If you or someone you know is experiencing anxiety, I encourage you to reach out and talk to someone, whether it be a professional or just someone you trust. It's very important to not go through this life alone. As we've mentioned earlier, community is extremely important and must be present in our lives. What's the quote? That like happiness is only happiness when it's shared or something. Yeah. If you like this video, like and subscribe for more school projects. Okay, now joining me today for this video is historical savant Davis Petro. Please join us. Yes.
Oh. You know what? That's why we're doing takes, baby.